Four luxury cars don't just show up in a neighborhood like this. Not on the east side of Detroit, where corner stores have bars on the windows and most vehicles on the street are held together with prayer and duct tape. But there they were, a black Mercedes S-Class gleaming like polished obsidian under the afternoon sun. Two midnight blue BMWs with chrome accents that caught the light, and a Range Rover that probably cost more than every house on the block combined. The engines purred with that particular sound expensive machinery makes, a low, confident rumble that announced money and power before anyone even stepped out. The sound was so foreign to this street that neighbors stopped mid-conversation to stare. Kids playing basketball 3 houses down let the ball bounce away, forgotten, rolling into the gutter while they watched. Mrs. Patricia Henderson, who'd lived on this corner for 43 years and thought she'd seen everything Detroit had to offer, dropped her grocery bag on the sidewalk. Eggs cracked unnoticed at her feet, yolks spreading across the concrete like small yellow suns. Mr. Raymond Washington, sitting on his porch like he did every afternoon, set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, squinting at the scene unfolding before him. The first car door opened with a soft, expensive click. Then the second, then the third and fourth, in perfect sequence like some choreographed performance. Men in dark suits emerged, the kind of suits that came with 6-figure salaries instead of hourly wages. They moved with purpose, but also with something else, tension, urgency, the bearing of people on a mission that couldn't wait another second. Security personnel, clearly. The way they scanned the area, positioned themselves strategically, communicated with subtle gestures and earpieces, these were professionals trained to protect someone important. But it was the man who stepped out of that first Mercedes who made everyone hold their breath. He was maybe late 30s, tall with broad shoulders, wearing a charcoal suit that had been tailored specifically for his frame and probably cost more than most people on this street made in 3 months. But he wore it like he'd forgotten he had it on, like clothes were the absolute last thing on his mind. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His tie was loosened, the knot pulled down from his collar. His face was unshaven, maybe 2 or 3 days of stubble darkening his jaw. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Those eyes held a haunted quality, the look of someone who'd been to hell and somehow, impossibly, had just been handed a map back. Michael Harrison stood on that Detroit sidewalk, his expensive Italian leather shoes looking absurdly out of place on the cracked concrete, and his eyes swept the modest shops and worn buildings with desperate intensity. Then they locked onto a single point, a small provision store with a faded painted sign that read Carter's Corner Shop in letters that had once been bright red but had weathered to a dusty pink. Through the shop's front window, clearly visible even from the street, was a little girl. She looked maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a clean pink t-shirt and jeans that actually fit her properly. She was standing at the shop counter, her small tongue stuck out in concentration, the way children do when they're deeply focused on something important. When Michael Harrison saw her, his entire body went rigid. His hand came up slowly to press against his chest, right over his heart, like someone had reached inside his ribcage and squeezed. His lips moved, forming a word that no one else could hear over the ambient noise of the street. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in 4 years, except when he stood in front of a granite headstone in Oakland Hills Memorial Cemetery. Emma. His legs seemed to lose their strength, and one of his security team members moved quickly to steady him, but Michael waved him away with a sharp gesture. Inside the shop, a woman in her early 30s was talking to the little girl, gesturing to different piles of coins and smiling encouragingly. The woman had warm brown skin, and her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a simple blue blouse, and there was something about the gentle way she interacted with the child that spoke of genuine care. This wasn't a teacher doing her job. This was someone who loved this little girl, someone who'd made space in her life and her heart for this child. Michael took a step forward, then another. His security team followed at a discreet distance, hands hovering near concealed weapons, eyes scanning for threats they were trained to identify. But Michael wasn't thinking about security or protocol or anything except the impossible sight in front of him. That little girl. That face he'd memorized from 1,000 photographs, from the dozens of home videos he watched late at night when the grief became unbearable. The face he saw every time he closed his eyes. The face he'd kissed goodnight for the last time 4 years ago, before she'd climbed into his car for what should have been a routine trip to her grandmother's house. The face of his daughter who had died in a car accident when she was 5 years old, except she was standing right there, alive, counting change in a rundown provision shop on Gratiot Avenue in Detroit. But to understand how we got to this impossible moment, how a billionaire manufacturing magnate came to be standing on a struggling Detroit street, staring at a daughter he'd buried 4 years ago, a daughter who'd been sleeping in an abandoned warehouse while he visited her grave every Sunday with fresh flowers and one-sided conversations, we need to go back 6 months to an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when nothing remarkable was supposed to happen. Back to a woman who had no idea that sharing her lunch was about to set in motion a series of events that would expose a conspiracy, reunite a shattered family, bring criminals to justice, and prove that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create ripples that change everything. This is the story of sacrifice and divine timing, of how one plate of food and one woman's willingness to give up everything became the catalyst for miracles that nobody saw coming. This is the story of Sonia Carter, Emma Grace Harrison, and the provision that God had been orchestrating all along, down to the penny, down to the second, down to the precise intersection of desperation and generosity that would reveal truth and restore what had been stolen. Before we go deeper into this remarkable journey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story will challenge everything you think you know about coincidence, about sacrifice, about how God works in the details we can't see. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Back to a Tuesday in March, to a provision shop on Gratiot Avenue, to a woman named Sonia Carter, who was about to meet a little girl who would change her life forever. 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, when Detroit was caught in that uncertain space between winter's last gasp and spring's tentative arrival, Sonia Marie Carter sat in her small provision shop, preparing to eat her lunch. The shop occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building that had seen better days, wedged between a barber shop that had been there since the 1970s and a vacant storefront with newspaper-covered windows. The space was modest, barely 800 square feet, but Sonia had made it welcoming. The floors were swept clean every morning. The shelves were organized by category with handwritten price tags that Sonia carefully updated whenever suppliers changed their rates. The small refrigerated section hummed reliably, stocked with milk, eggs, butter, and cold drinks. A handwritten sign near the register read, "God bless this business and all who enter." Sonia was 32 years old that March, unmarried, living in a small apartment with her mother, Linda. She'd never planned to still be single at 32, never imagined she'd be running a provision shop instead of walking runways in New York or Paris. But life had a way of redirecting dreams. Her father, Robert Carter, had walked out when Sonia was 7 years old. She still remembered the day a Saturday morning, her father loading boxes into his car while her mother stood on the porch crying. He'd said he needed to find himself, needed space, needed freedom from the responsibilities that were crushing him. What he'd actually needed was to abandon his family for a woman he'd met at work. Sonia had heard the truth years later, but by then it didn't matter. The damage was done. After Robert left, Linda had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. There were nights when Sonia went to bed hearing her mother cry in the next room, nights when dinner was crackers and peanut butter because that's all they had, nights when the electricity got shut off and they ate by candlelight, pretending it was an adventure. They had spent 8 months in a homeless shelter when Sonia was 9, after their landlord evicted them for being 3 months behind on rent. Sonia remembered the shelter vividly, the thin mattresses, the sounds of other people's nightmares, the shame of standing in line for donated clothes, the kindness of a volunteer named Mrs. Robinson, who'd slipped Sonia extra food and told her that God saw her struggle and wouldn't forget. But Linda Carter was made of steel, wrapped in faith. She prayed constantly, worked relentlessly, and taught Sonia that poverty was a circumstance, not an identity. By the time Sonia was 12, Linda had saved enough for a deposit on a tiny apartment. By the time Sonia was 16, Linda had worked her way up to manager at a grocery store. And by the time Sonia was 25, Linda had helped her daughter open this little shop, using every penny of her retirement savings as the down payment. It was Linda's gift to Sonia, a chance to build something, to be her own boss, to create the kind of security they had never had when Sonia was young. For 3 years since opening the shop, Sonia had been saving money in a wooden box under her bed. Every spare dollar went into that box. If she made an extra $50 one week, 40 of it went into the box. If she found a $5 bill in an old coat pocket, it went into the box. She kept a notebook where she tracked every deposit, the date, the amount, the running total. $273 one week, $287 the next, $52 the week after that when business was slow, $315 when she'd worked extra hours and skipped buying new shoes, even though hers were falling apart. The dream was specific and carefully calculated. The Elite Image Modeling Academy in New York City. It was the best program in the country, the one that had launched careers for women who were now household names. Sonia had wanted to model since she was a teenager, had that particular combination of height and bone structure and photogenic quality that professionals noticed. She'd done some local work in her 20s catalogs, local advertisements, a few small fashion shows, but to really make it, to actually build a career instead of just getting occasional gigs, she needed training from the best. The Elite Image Academy cost $14,000 for the 6-month intensive program, plus another $2,000 for housing and supplies. $16,000 total. At 32, Sonia knew her window was closing. The modeling industry wasn't kind to women over 35, and she was already pushing it. But she was so close now. The notebook under her bed showed a current total of $13,800, just $2,200 more. Another 4 months of saving, maybe 5 if business was slow. By August, she'd have enough. By September, she could be in New York, finally chasing the dream she'd held onto through shelter nights and electricity shutoffs and years of watching other people live the lives they wanted. That Tuesday afternoon, Sonia had just unwrapped her lunch fried chicken and rice that her mother had packed for her that morning, still warm in its container when she noticed someone standing at the edge of her shop. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days. Her jeans were too short, stopping well above her ankles and frayed at the hems. Her jacket was a boy's jacket, several sizes too big. The kind of thing you got from a donation bin when you couldn't be picky about fit or style. Her shoes were held together with duct tape, but it was her face that caught Sonia's attention. The girl had smudges of dirt on her cheeks, and her hair was tangled and matted, but her eyes, those eyes were locked on Sonia's lunch with an intensity that went beyond normal childhood hunger. Sonia had seen hunger before. She'd felt it herself as a child, but this was different. This was the look of someone who didn't know when they'd eat again, someone for whom food wasn't a routine occurrence, but a desperate need. The girl wasn't moving closer, wasn't asking for anything, just standing there about 10 feet from the shop entrance, staring at that container of chicken and rice like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Sonia called out to her, asking if she was hungry, and the girl's head snapped up like she'd been caught doing something wrong. For a second, Sonia thought she might run, but then the girl nodded slowly and took a tentative step closer. Sonia asked when she'd last eaten, and the girl's answer came in a voice so quiet, Sonia almost didn't hear it. "Yesterday morning," the girl said. Someone had given her half a sandwich. Sonia felt something twist in her chest. Yesterday morning. That meant this child had gone more than 24 hours without food. Sonia stood up and walked to the shop entrance, container of chicken and rice in her hands. She asked the girl's name, and after a pause, the girl said, "Emma. Emma Thompson." Sonia didn't know it then, but that name was a lie, a protective shell this child had built around her real identity. Without thinking twice about her own hunger, about the fact that she'd planned on this being her lunch and wouldn't have time to get more until evening, Sonia held out the container and told Emma to take it. The girl's eyes went wide with disbelief. "All of it?" she asked. "All of it," Sonia confirmed. Emma sat down right there on the curb outside the shop and began to eat. But she didn't eat the way most starving children would eat, frantically shoveling food into their mouths as fast as possible. Instead, Emma ate slowly, deliberately, savoring every single bite. She'd take a small forkful of rice, chew it thoroughly, close her eyes like she was trying to memorize the taste. She'd take a small bite of chicken and make it last as long as possible. It was the eating pattern of someone who'd learned to survive on very little. someone who knew that meals were rare and had to be stretched, someone who'd developed the discipline to make food last, even when every instinct screamed to devour it all at once. Watching this little girl eat her lunch, Sonia was transported back 23 years. She was 9 years old again, sitting in that homeless shelter, eating the dinner that Mrs. Robinson had given her. She had eaten slowly too, trying to make it last, knowing that breakfast was uncertain and lunch was hours away. She remembered the shame of being hungry, the way it felt to have your stomach cramping, while other kids talked about where they were going for dinner. She remembered the kindness of people who shared food without making you feel like a beggar, who gave with grace instead of pity. And sitting there watching Emma, Sonia understood that God had put this child in her path for a reason. When Emma finished eating, she carefully wiped the fork clean with her finger, licking off every last grain of rice. She folded the napkin Sonia had given her, set it neatly on top of the empty container, and looked up with eyes that were trying very hard not to cry. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Thank you so much, miss." Sonia told her she was welcome and asked where Emma's parents were. The girl's face changed at that question, a shuttered look coming down like a wall. "They're around," Emma said, not meeting Sonia's eyes. "Around where?" Sonia pressed gently. "Just around," Emma repeated. She wouldn't say more than that. Sonia asked where Emma lived, and the girl's answer was carefully vague. "Different places," she said. "I move around." Something about the way she said it made Sonia's chest tighten with recognition. "Different places, move around." Those were the same phrases Sonia had used as a child, when she was too ashamed to tell people her family was homeless, when she didn't want to admit they were sleeping in a shelter, or in their car, or on a cousin's couch. Different places was code for nowhere stable, nowhere safe, nowhere that felt like home. Emma stood up to leave, still holding the empty container, and Sonia quickly told her to wait. She went back into the shop and grabbed a paper bag, filling it with items from the shelves: a package of crackers, 2 granola bars, an apple, a bottle of water, a small bag of chips. She came back outside and handed the bag to Emma, telling her to take it for later. Emma stared at the bag like Sonia had just handed her gold bars. "Why are you being so nice to me?" Emma asked, and there were tears in her eyes now, actual tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. "Nobody is ever nice to me. Why are you different?" Sonia knelt down so she was at Emma's eye level, and she told her the truth. "Because I remember what it's like to be hungry," she said. "I remember what it's like when nobody seems to care if you're okay or not. And because someone was nice to me once when I really needed it, and it saved my life. So now, I'm being nice to you." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the dirt on her face, and whispered another "thank you" before turning and walking away. Sonia watched her go, watched this little girl disappear around the corner, clutching that paper bag like it was treasure. And she stood there for a long time, wondering what kind of world leaves a child to fend for herself. That evening, when Sonia got home to the small apartment she shared with her mother, Linda was cooking dinner beans and rice, cheap and filling. Sonia told her about Emma, about the way the girl had stared at the food, about the 24 hours without eating, about the vague answers when asked about parents or home. Linda stopped stirring the pot and turned to look at her daughter with an expression that mixed sadness and recognition. "A little girl that young, on the streets alone," Linda said. "Baby, that's not just unfortunate, that's dangerous. Where are her parents?" Sonia admitted she didn't know, that Emma wouldn't say, but the way the girl had talked about staying in different places suggested she had no stable home. Linda asked about Sonia's savings, whether she was still on track for the modeling academy, and Sonia nodded. "Yes," she told her mother, "another 4 or 5 months and I'll have enough." Linda smiled with pride. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she said. "You've worked harder than anyone I know. You deserve this dream." But that night, lying in bed, Sonia couldn't stop thinking about Emma. She kept seeing those eyes locked on the food container, kept hearing that quiet voice saying nobody is ever nice to me, kept wondering where Emma was sleeping that night and whether anyone in the world besides Sonia even cared. The next morning, Sonia woke up still thinking about Emma and wondering if she'd see the girl again. Part of her hoped she would, and part of her hoped she wouldn't, because if Emma came back, it would confirm that the situation was as bad as Sonia suspected. When Sonia got to her shop that morning, she found herself packing extra food more than she needed for herself, just in case. She made 2 sandwiches instead of 1, packed an extra apple, filled a second water bottle, just in case. She'd been open for about an hour when she looked up and saw Emma standing at the corner of the street, watching the shop. The girl wasn't approaching yet, just standing there like she was trying to decide whether it was safe to come closer, whether yesterday's kindness had been real or a fluke. Sonia stepped outside and waved, calling Emma's name, and the girl's face lit up with a smile that transformed her whole appearance. She walked quickly toward the shop, not quite running, but faster than a casual walk, and when she reached Sonia, she said good morning with such politeness that it made Sonia's heart ache. "Good morning, Emma," Sonia replied. "Are you hungry?" Emma nodded, and Sonia brought out the extra food she'd packed: a sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, a small bag of chips. Emma's eyes went wide again, that same disbelieving expression from yesterday. "This is all for me?" she asked. "All for you," Sonia confirmed. Emma took the food and sat down on the same curb as yesterday and began eating with that same careful, measured approach. After a few minutes, Emma looked up at Sonia and asked a question that revealed more about her situation than anything she'd said before. "Miss Sonia," Emma said, "do you need any help around your shop? I'm really good at organizing things. I can clean. I can carry boxes. I'm stronger than I look, I promise. I don't want to just take food from you. I want to help. I want to earn it." Sonia felt tears prick her eyes. This little girl, who couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds, who was clearly malnourished and exhausted, wanted to work for the food instead of accepting it as charity. It was pride, pure and simple. Even in her poverty and desperation, Emma had pride and dignity, and a need to contribute rather than just receive. Sonia understood that pride because her mother had taught her the same thing. Linda had always insisted on working for what they got, had always found ways to contribute or give back even when they had nothing. When they'd stayed at the shelter, Linda had volunteered to help in the kitchen. When neighbors gave them food, Linda would insist on babysitting their children or helping with cleaning in return. She'd taught Sonia that poverty didn't mean you had to lose your dignity, that accepting help was okay as long as you gave back in whatever way you could. So Sonia agreed to let Emma help, but only if Emma promised something in return. "What?" Emma asked, looking worried. "Promise me you'll come here every day," Sonia said. "Every single day, for breakfast and lunch. No more skipping meals." Emma stared at her like she was trying to understand if this was real. "Every day?" she repeated. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Sonia said firmly. "Every day." Emma's response was a nod so vigorous it looked like her head might come loose, and she whispered, "Yes, yes, I promise. Thank you so much." That became their routine over the next 3 weeks. Emma would show up every morning shortly after Sonia opened the shop, and Sonia would give her breakfast. Emma would help organize shelves, sweep the floor, greet customers with such polite sweetness that people immediately fell in love with her. Around noon, Sonia would give Emma lunch, and they'd sit together while Emma ate, and they talked about small things, the weather, the customers who'd come in, little observations about the neighborhood. Emma never volunteered information about her home life or her family, and Sonia learned not to push too hard with questions. She didn't want to scare the girl away. During those 3 weeks, Sonia started bringing Emma clean clothes, nothing expensive, just items from thrift stores and donation bins. A jacket that actually fit when the March weather stayed cold, a pair of jeans that were the right length, shoes that didn't have holes, socks, a hairbrush. Emma accepted each item with tears and gratitude that seemed disproportionate to the gift, until Sonia realized these were probably the first new-to-her items this child had received in years. The customers who came into the shop noticed Emma and started bringing her little presents too. Mrs. Henderson brought a coloring book and crayons. Mr. Washington from down the street brought a small stuffed animal. The teenage girl who bought snacks after school brought hair ribbons. Emma's appearance gradually improved. Her face got cleaner. Her hair, once Sonia showed her how to brush out the tangles, started to look less matted. She smiled more easily, laughed at small jokes, seemed to relax in Sonia's presence. But Sonia noticed things that troubled her. Emma never, ever talked about where she slept. If Sonia asked what she'd done the previous evening, Emma would change the subject. If Sonia asked where she went when she left the shop, Emma would give vague answers. And every evening around closing time, Emma would get this look on her face, a mixture of fear and resignation, like she was preparing herself to walk back into something terrible. One evening, about 3 weeks after their first meeting, Sonia asked directly, "Emma, where do you go when you leave here? Where do you sleep at night?" Emma's face shut down immediately. "I'm okay, Miss Sonia," she said. "Don't worry about me." "But I do worry about you," Sonia pressed. "You're just a little girl. You should have adults taking care of you." "I do take care of myself," Emma said, and there was a strange pride in her voice mixed with sadness. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I'm really good at it. I'm good at surviving." That word surviving hit Sonia hard. Not living, not thriving, surviving. This 8-year-old girl described her existence as surviving, and she said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. Sonia wanted to push harder, wanted to demand answers, but she could see Emma pulling away, could see the walls going up. So she backed off, but the question haunted her for the rest of the evening and through a largely sleepless night. The next day, Sonia made a decision that would change everything. That evening, after Emma left the shop with her usual package of leftovers and supplies, Sonia locked up quickly and followed her. She stayed far enough back that Emma wouldn't notice, moving from storefront to storefront to maintain cover, watching as the little girl walked through their neighborhood on Gratiot Avenue, past the grocery store where Sonia's mother used to work, past the library and the community center. Emma walked with purpose, taking turns that suggested she'd made this journey many times before, moving into areas that became increasingly industrial and abandoned as the residential neighborhoods gave way to warehouses and empty lots. After about 30 minutes of walking, Emma approached an area that Sonia recognized the old Morrison warehouse district. These buildings had been abandoned for years, ever since the factory that anchored them had closed down and moved operations to Mexico. Sonia's heart started pounding as she watched Emma approach one particular warehouse, a massive structure with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Emma looked around quickly, checking to see if anyone was watching, then slipped through a gap in the fence that surrounded the property. Sonia waited a few moments, then moved closer, finding a spot where she could see through one of the broken ground floor windows without being spotted. What she saw inside that warehouse made her press her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out loud. Emma had created a small living space in one corner of the vast empty building. There was a thin blanket spread on the concrete floor, the kind of emergency blanket they give out at shelters, worn and threadbare. Next to the blanket was a backpack, and Emma was carefully unpacking it, taking out what appeared to be all her worldly possessions, a change of clothes, a flashlight, the stuffed animal Mr. Washington had given her, some of the food items Sonia had provided over the past weeks. Sonia watched as Emma pulled something else from the backpack, a photograph in a cracked frame. Even from her vantage point, Sonia could see it was old and faded. Emma held the photograph carefully, pressing it against her chest, and Sonia saw her lips moving, saw that she was talking to the picture. After a moment, Emma kissed the photograph and set it down carefully on the blanket next to her makeshift pillow. Then she pulled out the food Sonia had given her and ate about half of one sandwich, wrapping up the rest carefully and putting it back in the backpack. She was rationing it, Sonia realized, making it last because she didn't know when the next meal would come. Emma lay down on her blanket, still fully clothed, including her jacket and shoes, and pulled a second thin blanket over herself. She positioned the flashlight next to her head, within easy reach, and lay there staring up at the warehouse ceiling. From where Sonia stood, she could see that Emma wasn't sleeping. The girl's eyes were wide open, and even in the fading light, Sonia could see tears running down her cheeks. Emma lay there silently crying for several minutes before finally curling into a ball and closing her eyes. Sonia backed away from the window as quietly as possible, not wanting Emma to know she'd been watched. But once she was far enough away, once she'd made it back to the street and to her car, the composure she'd been maintaining shattered completely. She sat in her car and sobbed deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of horror and heartbreak and rage at a world that would let this happen to a child. That little girl was sleeping in an abandoned warehouse, alone, on concrete, with no heat, no running water, no protection from anyone who might wander in during the night. How long had Emma been living like this? How had she survived? How was she even alive? When Sonia finally got home, her eyes red and her face swollen from crying, Linda knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. "What happened, baby?" her mother asked, pulling Sonia into a hug, and Sonia told her everything about following Emma, about the warehouse, about the photograph and the blanket, and the way Emma rationed her food because she didn't know when she'd eat again. Linda gasped, her hand coming up to cover her mouth, her own eyes filling with tears. "Jesus have mercy," she whispered. "A little girl, in that place, alone. Baby, we have to do something. We can't leave her there." But what could they do? Their own apartment was small, barely enough room for the two of them. They weren't licensed foster parents. They didn't have the resources to take in a child officially. But they also couldn't leave Emma in that warehouse, couldn't keep sending her back there every night knowing what they now knew. Sonia and her mother talked for hours that night, going through options, trying to figure out a solution. By midnight, they'd made a decision. They'd ask Emma to come live with them. They'd make it work somehow. They'd convert the living room into a bedroom, get a fold-out couch, rearrange everything. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be better than a warehouse. The next morning, Sonia woke up with a plan. She went to the children's clothing store on Woodward Avenue and used money from her modeling fund to buy Emma proper clothes, not thrift store items this time, but new clothes. A warm winter coat, because spring in Detroit could still be cold. Jeans that fit correctly. Several shirts, a pack of underwear and socks. Good shoes, a hairbrush and hair ties. She also bought Emma a small suitcase because she'd need something to carry her belongings in when she moved in with Sonia and Linda. Sonia brought everything back to her shop and hid the bags behind the counter, planning to surprise Emma when she arrived. She kept watching the street, waiting to see Emma turn the corner the way she did every morning, already imagining the girl's face when she saw all the new clothes, when Sonia told her she didn't have to go back to that warehouse ever again, that she had a real home now, with people who cared about her. Around 9:30 that morning, Sonia saw Emma in the distance. The girl was running, moving faster than Sonia had ever seen her move, with a big smile on her face. She was waving, clearly excited about something, and Sonia stepped toward the shop door, smiling too, about to wave back. Then Sonia heard it, an engine revving louder than it should. She looked left and saw a car coming down Gratiot Avenue too fast, weaving slightly like the driver wasn't paying attention, and Emma was running into the street, not looking, focused only on getting to the shop, on getting to Sonia. Everything that happened next seemed to occur in slow motion and at lightning speed simultaneously. Sonia screamed Emma's name and started running toward the street. Emma's head turned at the sound of Sonia's scream, and for just a second, their eyes met. Then the car hit her, and the car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. It just kept going, the driver either unaware or uncaring that they'd just hit a child. Sonia reached Emma in seconds that felt like hours. Sonia dropped to her knees beside Emma, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. She was screaming for help, begging someone to call 911, her voice raw and desperate. "Emma," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, even though panic was clawing at her throat. "Emma, baby, can you hear me? Stay with me. Help is coming. You're going to be okay." Emma's lips moved, and Sonia leaned closer, trying to hear what she was saying. The words came out barely above a whisper. "Miss Sonia." "I'm sorry. I wasn't watching." "Don't apologize," Sonia said, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't your fault. Just stay with me. Keep breathing. Help is coming." People were gathering now, neighbors and shopkeepers rushing out to see what happened. Mrs. Henderson was there, pressing her hands to her mouth, crying. Mr. Washington was on his phone with emergency services. The basketball-playing teenagers from down the street had stopped their game and come running, one of them pulling off his jacket to put under Emma's head. Emma tried to speak again, and Sonia told her to save her strength, but Emma was insistent. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being nice to me, for feeding me, for caring." Those words hit Sonia like a physical blow because they sounded like goodbye, like Emma thought she was dying and wanted to express gratitude one last time. "No," Sonia said firmly. "No. You're not saying goodbye. You're going to be fine. We're going to get you to the hospital, and you're going to be fine." But Emma's eyes were closing, her breathing getting weaker, and Sonia started praying out loud right there on the street. "God, please, please don't take her. Please save her. She's been through so much already. Please don't let her die like this. Please." Mr. Washington was beside Sonia now, his hand on her shoulder, telling her the ambulance was 5 minutes away. "Just hold on, just keep talking to her, keep her conscious." Sonia kept talking to Emma, kept saying her name, kept begging her to stay awake, to keep fighting, to hold on just a little longer. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later, though it felt like 6 hours. Paramedics jumped out and immediately went to work, checking Emma's vitals, stabilizing her neck, starting an IV. One of them asked Sonia if she was the mother, and Sonia said no, but she was all Emma had. There was no one else. The paramedic nodded and said Sonia could ride in the ambulance. They loaded Emma onto a stretcher, moving with practiced efficiency, and Sonia climbed into the back of the ambulance, holding Emma's hand, praying continuously under her breath. The ride to Detroit Medical Center was the longest 15 minutes of Sonia's life. The paramedics worked on Emma, talking to each other in medical terminology that Sonia didn't fully understand, but could tell meant the situation was serious. One of them kept saying her pressure's dropping, need to move faster. The driver hit the sirens and the ambulance surged forward, weaving through traffic. Sonia held Emma's small hand and kept whispering to her. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving you. You're not alone. Hold on, baby girl. Just hold on." At the hospital, they wheeled Emma straight into the emergency room, nurses and doctors converging immediately. Someone tried to stop Sonia from following, saying she'd have to wait outside, but Sonia pushed through, saying she was all Emma had. There was no one else. Please don't make her be alone. A kind-faced nurse finally nodded and let Sonia stay to the side while they worked. Sonia watched them cut away Emma's clothes, watched them assess the damage, heard them rattling off medical terms, internal bleeding. After about 10 minutes that felt like 10 years, a doctor approached Sonia. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, with eyes that had seen too much suffering but still held compassion. "Are you family?" he asked. Sonia explained that she wasn't, that Emma was a homeless child she'd been helping, that as far as Sonia knew, Emma had no family or anyone else who cared about her. The doctor's expression shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with resignation. "I see," he said quietly. "Then I need you to understand the situation. She has severe internal injuries. We need to operate immediately." Sonia nodded, struggling to process all of this. The doctor continued. "The surgery alone will take several hours. After that, she'll need at least a week in intensive care, possibly longer depending on complications. I need you to go to the billing office to authorize payment before we can proceed." Sonia's mind stuttered at that last sentence. Payment? But this was an emergency. Surely they'd treat her first and worry about payment later. The doctor must have seen the confusion on Sonia's face because he sighed. "I wish we could just start, but hospital policy requires payment authorization for non-insured patients before major surgery. I'm sorry. The billing office is down the hall to the left." Sonia found her way to the billing office in a daze, her hands still covered in Emma's blood, her mind struggling to shift from terror to bureaucracy. The clerk behind the desk was a middle-aged woman with glasses and an expression that suggested she'd had this conversation too many times. She pulled up information on her computer and asked for the patient's insurance information. Sonia explained that Emma didn't have insurance, that she was homeless. The clerk's expression didn't change, just nodded and typed. Then she turned her screen towards Sonia. "The total cost for emergency surgery and 1 week of intensive care is $13,800, the clerk said. "We can arrange a payment plan if you need, but we'll need at least 50% down before we can proceed with surgery. How will you be paying today?" Sonia stared at the screen. At that number, $13,800. She felt the air leave her lungs. She felt the world tilt sideways, because that number wasn't random. It wasn't approximately close to what she'd saved. It was exact. To the dollar. The precise amount she'd been saving for 3 years for her modeling dream. $13,800. The same amount down to the penny that was sitting in a wooden box under her bed, in a notebook where every single dollar was accounted for. For 3 years, she'd been working toward $14,000 for the academy, plus $2,000 for expenses. Last week, she'd deposited another $100, bringing her total to exactly $13,800. She'd been so close, just 2,200 away from her dream, and now a hospital clerk was telling her that saving Emma's life would cost every penny of it. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Sonia heard herself asking if she could have a moment, and the clerk nodded. Sonia walked out of the billing office and stood in the hospital hallway, her back against the wall, trying to breathe. Her whole body was shaking. She looked down at her hands and saw they were still stained with Emma's blood. This little girl who'd been sleeping in a warehouse, who'd been surviving on scraps and kindness, who'd said thank you for being nice to me, like it was the most remarkable thing in the world. This child who had no one, who'd been abandoned by everyone, who thought she was dying and wanted to express gratitude with what might be her last words. Sonia's phone rang. It was her mother. "Baby, what happened?" "Mrs. Henderson called me. She said Emma got hit by a car. Is she okay?" Sonia couldn't speak at first. When the words finally came, they were broken and painful. "Mom," she said, "the surgery. It cost $13,800. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Linda's sharp intake of breath as she understood. "Oh, Jesus," she whispered. That's exactly what you've saved." "Yes," Sonia said. "Exactly." Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question that Sonia had been asking herself since seeing that number on the screen. "What are you going to do, baby?" Sonia closed her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "Mom, it's everything. 3 years, every dollar I've worked for. The academy deadline is in 6 weeks. If I give this money to the hospital, I'm done. I'll never save that much again. By the time I could, I'll be too old. This is my only chance." "I know, baby," Linda said gently. And Sonia heard in her mother's voice that Linda did know, that she understood exactly what this choice meant because Linda had sacrificed her own dreams to raise Sonia alone. "What does your heart tell you?" Linda asked. "What does your heart say is right?" And Sonia thought about Emma lying on that pavement, whispering, "Thank you." She thought about Emma sleeping in a warehouse, about the photograph the girl pressed to her chest every night, about the way Emma had asked, "Why are you being nice to me?" like kindness was some foreign concept. She thought about the 8-year-old child who'd been surviving alone, with no one to care whether she lived or died. "My heart says I can't let her die," Sonia said, and as she spoke the words, she felt something settle inside her. "My heart says that little girl matters more than my dreams, that her life is worth more than my career, that I'll never be able to live with myself if I choose modeling over saving a child." Linda was crying on the other end of the phone. "I know that was hard to say," she said, "and I'm so proud of you. So proud. You're doing exactly what Jesus would do." "But, Mom," Sonia said, her own tears flowing freely now, "this is everything I've worked for. Everything. 3 years of sacrifice and dreaming and planning, gone in one moment." "I know," Linda said. "I know, baby. But maybe that's not how God sees it. Maybe He's been preparing you for exactly this moment. Maybe those 3 years weren't about modeling at all. Maybe they were about having exactly what was needed to save exactly this child at exactly this time." Sonia thought about that, about divine timing, about how the surgery cost exactly what she'd saved. Not approximately close, but exactly the same. About how she'd been depositing money into that box for 3 years without knowing why she felt such urgency to save, such compulsion to keep adding to it, even when it meant going without things she needed. What if her mother was right? What if the modeling dream had been the vehicle God used to get her to save money, but the real purpose had always been Emma? "I'm going to do it," Sonia said. "I'm going to give them the money. I'm going to save her." Linda's voice was thick with emotion when she replied, "I'll come to the hospital right now. You don't have to go through this alone." "Thank you," Sonia said. "But first, I need to go home and get the money. Can you meet me there? We'll go together." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Linda said. Sonia went back to the billing office and told the clerk she'd have the money within the hour. She just needed to go home and get it. The clerk, to her credit, showed a flash of humanity. She nodded and said she'd let the surgical team know to prep, that they could begin as soon as payment was confirmed. Sonia ran to her car and drove home faster than was probably safe, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. When she got to her apartment, Linda was already there, waiting at the door. They went inside together, and Sonia went straight to her bedroom. She pulled the wooden box from under her bed and set it on the floor. This box had been her hope for 3 years. Every time she'd felt discouraged about being 32 and still not living her dream, she'd look at this box and remind herself she was making progress. Every time she'd wanted to spend money on something fun or frivolous, she'd think about this box and make the sacrifice. This box represented every extra shift she'd worked, every dinner she'd skipped, every invitation she'd declined because she was saving money. Linda sat down on the floor beside her daughter, and they both just looked at the box for a moment. Sonia had decorated it years ago with magazine cutouts of models and fashion shows, visual reminders of where she was trying to go. Inside were carefully organized bills, hundreds, 50s, 20s, 10s, 5s, and 1s, all sorted and counted. The notebook beside it tracked every deposit with the date and amount. 3 years of meticulous record-keeping. Sonia picked up the notebook and flipped through it, seeing her own handwriting document the journey. March 15th. 3 years ago, first deposit, $200. April 2nd, $150. May 12th, $300. Page after page of deposits, of sacrifice, of delayed gratification. The last entry was from the previous week, $100, bringing the total to $13,800. She set down the notebook and opened the box. The money was real, tangible, the result of actual work and actual sacrifice. This wasn't theoretical or abstract. This was 3 years of her life in physical form. Sonia started to cry, not gentle tears, but deep, racking sobs that came from somewhere so deep it felt like her soul was breaking. Linda put her arm around Sonia's shoulders and cried with her, and for several minutes they just sat there on the bedroom floor, grieving the death of a dream. Finally, Sonia wiped her eyes and started taking money out of the box. She counted it out carefully, years of habit making her automatically verify the amount, even though she knew exactly what was there. $13,800. Not a penny more or less. She put it all in a large envelope, sealed it, and stood up. Linda stood too and pulled her daughter into a tight hug. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now. I know it feels like you're losing everything. But you're doing what's right, and God will honor that." "Will He?" Sonia asked, her voice small and broken. "Because right now, it just feels like I'm giving up everything I've worked for, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to start over." "You are strong enough," Linda said firmly. "You're my daughter. You're stronger than you know. And God's not done with your story. Trust Him. Even when it hurts, even when you can't see how it could possibly work out. Trust Him." They drove back to the hospital together, and Sonia walked to the billing office with the envelope of cash. The clerk counted it carefully, gave Sonia a receipt, and said she'd notify the surgical team that they were cleared to proceed. The surgery would begin within the hour. Sonia took the receipt and walked back to the waiting area where Linda was sitting. She handed her mother the empty envelope, and something about that empty envelope made it all feel terribly final. 3 years of work, gone. The dream she'd held onto through poverty and struggle and doubt, gone. Her future as she'd imagined it, gone. But Emma would live. If the surgery was successful, that little girl would get a chance at the life she'd been denied for so long. And somehow, sitting in that waiting room with her mother, Sonia felt something she didn't expect. Peace. Not happiness, not joy, not anything positive, really. Just peace. The sense that she'd made the choice her soul could live with, even if it cost her everything else. She thought about Emma whispering, "Thank you for being nice to me." And Sonia understood that some things mattered more than personal dreams. Some things were worth any sacrifice. The surgery lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of Sonia and Linda sitting in that waiting room, praying and worrying and watching other families come and go. 9 hours of imagining all the ways the surgery could go wrong, all the complications that could arise. 9 hours of bargaining with God, of promising to be better and do more if He would just save this little girl. Finally, at almost 8 o'clock that evening, a doctor came out. He looked exhausted but not defeated, and Sonia took that as a good sign. "She made it," he said, and Sonia felt her knees go weak with relief. The surgery was successful. We were able to repair the internal bleeding, set the broken bones, and address the head trauma. She's in recovery now. The next 48 hours will be critical, but if she remains stable, The prognosis is good. Sonia started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much." The doctor nodded. "She'll be in intensive care for at least a week. You can see her briefly once she's settled in her room, probably in another hour or so." When they finally let Sonia in to see Emma, the sight of the little girl connected to all those machines and monitors made Sonia's chest tighten. Emma was so small in that hospital bed, so fragile looking with the bandages and tubes and IV lines. But she was alive. Her chest was rising and falling. Her heart was beating steadily on the monitor. She was alive. Sonia sat down in the chair beside the bed and took Emma's small hand in hers. She leaned close and whispered, "Hey, baby girl, you're gonna be okay. You made it, and I'm right here. I'm not leaving you." Emma didn't respond, still deep in the anesthesia-induced sleep, but Sonia stayed there holding her hand for the rest of the evening. Linda eventually convinced Sonia to go home and get some rest, promising to stay with Emma overnight so the girl wouldn't be alone. Sonia reluctantly agreed, but before leaving, she made a promise to the sleeping child. "When you wake up," she said quietly, "you're never going back to that warehouse. You're coming home with me and my mom. I don't know how we'll make it work, but we will, because you're not alone anymore. You have a family now." Over the next 3 days, Sonia basically lived at the hospital. She'd arrive early in the morning and stay until late at night, only going home to shower and change clothes. Linda would take shifts too, making sure Emma was never alone. On the 3rd day after the surgery, Emma woke up. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and disoriented. And then they found Sonia sitting in the chair beside her bed. For a moment, Emma just stared, like she was trying to understand if this was real or a dream. Then tears started rolling down her cheeks. "You stayed," Emma whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube they had removed that morning. "You're still here." "Where else would I be?" Sonia said gently, moving closer to the bed. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart." Emma closed her eyes, more tears escaping. "I thought I was dying," she said. "I thought I was going to die alone. I kept trying to tell you thank you because I thought those would be my last words." "You're not dying," Sonia said firmly. "You're going to be just fine. But Emma, we need to talk about some things." Over the next few hours, Sonia gently questioned Emma about her situation. Where were her parents? How long had she been on the streets? Why was she all alone? At first, Emma was reluctant to answer, clearly scared that telling the truth would make Sonia stop caring. But eventually, with patient, gentle persistence, the whole story came out. And it was so much worse than Sonia had imagined. Emma's real name wasn't Emma Thompson. It was Emma Grace Harrison. And the story of how she ended up alone was a nightmare that made Sonia's blood run cold and her hands shake with rage. Emma's mother had died giving birth to her complications that the doctors said were unpredictable. A perfect storm of medical circumstances that took a healthy 30-year-old woman's life within hours of bringing her daughter into the world. Emma's father, Michael Harrison, had been left to raise her alone. And by all accounts, he'd done everything right. He'd hired the best nannies, made sure Emma had everything she needed, but most importantly, he'd been present. He'd been the one to give her bottles in the middle of the night. The one to read bedtime stories, the one to kiss scraped knees and celebrate first words and document every milestone. Michael Harrison owned Harrison Manufacturing, one of the largest factory operations in Michigan. He was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, lived in a mansion in Bloomfield Hills, and appeared regularly in Detroit business publications as one of the region's most successful entrepreneurs. But none of that mattered to Emma when she was little. What mattered was that her daddy tucked her in every night, that he made her pancakes on Saturday mornings, that he took her to the park, and Emma had been happy, really, genuinely happy. Then, nearly 4 years ago, when Emma had just turned 5, everything changed in a single afternoon. Emma and her father were driving to visit Michael's mother when a semi-truck suddenly swerved into their lane. The driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. The massive truck clipped their vehicle with devastating force. Their car spun violently across 3 lanes, struck the concrete barrier, then bounced back into traffic where it was hit again. Emma's last clear memory of that day was the sound of crunching metal and her father shouting her name. When Emma woke up, she was in a hospital room. But it wasn't the hospital where her father had been taken. A woman was in the room with her. She introduced herself as Patricia Hendricks and said she was a social worker with Child Protective Services. She told 5-year-old Emma that there had been a very bad accident, that her daddy had been hurt very badly. And then she told Emma that her father had died. Emma insisted her daddy was coming to get her, but Patricia Hendricks kept saying the same thing, kept explaining that Emma's daddy was gone, that she had no other family, that Emma would be placed in foster care. The woman was lying about all of it. Michael Harrison hadn't died. He'd been seriously injured and had been in a medically induced coma for 3 days. But he'd survived. He was alive. But Emma didn't know that. Within 48 hours of the accident, Patricia Hendricks had Emma transferred to a different hospital under a false name, Emma Johnson, where records would be harder to trace. Then Emma was placed in a foster home on the other side of Detroit, far from anyone who might recognize her. The foster home was run by a couple named Richard and Susan Coleman, who happened to be Patricia Hendricks' cousins. They'd been paid well to take Emma and keep her isolated and quiet. The Colemans had 3 other foster children already, all crammed into a small house. Emma was given a mattress in the basement, told to stay quiet and out of the way, and fed minimally. After 3 months of living in that basement, eating scraps, and being told daily that she was unwanted, Emma made a decision. One night in late summer, Emma packed the few belongings she had into a small backpack, a change of clothes, the photograph of her mother, her hospital bracelet that said, "Baby Girl Harrison," and a necklace that had belonged to her mother. Then she climbed onto a shelf, pushed out the small basement window, and squeezed through. She was tiny for her age, barely 40 pounds. Then she ran. Emma had been 5 years old when she escaped. For the next 3 years she'd been living on the streets of Detroit. She learned which restaurants threw away edible food, which dumpsters behind grocery stores had the best finds, where she could get water. She learned to avoid dangerous adults, to stay away from groups of teenagers, to recognize the signs of someone who might hurt her. She moved constantly, never staying in one place more than a few nights. She'd tried once, about a year after running away, to find her father. She'd called Harrison Manufacturing and told the receptionist that her name was Emma Harrison and she needed to talk to her daddy. The woman on the phone had laughed and told Emma that Mr. Harrison's daughter had died years ago, and making prank calls wasn't funny. Then she'd hung up. After that, Emma had given up. As Emma told this story, lying in that hospital bed with tears running down her face, Sonia felt a cold rage building in her chest. Someone had deliberately separated this child from her father. Someone had lied to a 5-year-old girl, told her she was alone in the world, and then placed her in an abusive situation. When Emma ran away, they'd simply let her disappear into the streets. Sonia asked Emma about her father's full name, and when Emma said Michael David Harrison, Sonia felt recognition hit her like a wave. Harrison Manufacturing. She'd seen that name everywhere in Detroit, on billboards, in business journals. Michael Harrison was one of the wealthiest men in Michigan, and his daughter had been sleeping in an abandoned warehouse. Sonia told Emma that they needed to find her father, that they needed to tell him she was alive. But Emma panicked. What if he doesn't want me? What if he has a new family? What if seeing me again just makes him angry? Sonia took Emma's hand. Baby girl, if your father is alive and knows you're alive, I promise you, he wants you. Over the next 2 weeks, Sonia made dozens of phone calls to Harrison Manufacturing, trying desperately to reach Michael Harrison. But every single call ended the same way. Secretaries and assistants insisted politely but firmly that Mr. Harrison's daughter had passed away years ago, that this was clearly some sort of scam, and that they couldn't put through calls claiming otherwise. One assistant had been particularly blunt. "Ma'am, I understand you think you're helping someone, but Mr. Harrison visits his daughter's grave every single Sunday." Calling him with false hope would be incredibly cruel. A week after Emma told Sonia the truth, Emma was released from the hospital. Sonia brought her home to the small apartment she shared with Linda, and Linda had prepared for Emma's arrival by converting part of the living room into a bedroom space. It wasn't fancy, just a fold-out couch covered with cheerful blankets, a small dresser from a thrift store, and some stuffed animals Linda had collected from neighbors. When Emma walked into that apartment and saw the space that had been prepared for her, she stood frozen in the doorway. "This is for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of this?" Linda knelt down. "Yes, baby girl. This is your home now. For as long as you need it." Emma's face scrunched up and she started crying. Overwhelmed tears. The tears of someone who'd been holding on to pain for so long that kindness felt almost painful. Linda pulled Emma into a hug, and Emma clung to her. "I've never had a home before," Emma sobbed. "Not a real one. Not since my daddy. Not for so long." "You have one now," Sonia said, "and we're your family." For the next 6 weeks, Emma lived with Sonia and Linda, and slowly, so slowly, she began to believe that maybe this was real. Maybe these people really weren't going to send her away. She started to relax in ways she hadn't been able to relax in years. She slept through the night. She ate without rationing. She laughed more easily. Sonia enrolled Emma in a local elementary school, and Emma proved to be a bright student who was hungry to learn. She made friends quickly, but even as Emma settled into this new life, Sonia couldn't stop thinking about Michael Harrison. Somewhere in this city, a man thought his daughter was dead. He'd been living with that grief for nearly 4 years, visiting a grave, mourning a loss that wasn't real. It felt wrong to keep that secret. But how? No one would listen. Then, 6 weeks after Emma had come to live with them, everything changed because of a video. One of the neighbors who'd witnessed Emma's accident had filmed part of the aftermath, the ambulance arriving, Sonia crying and praying over Emma, the crowd gathering. He'd posted it to a local Facebook group with a caption about how a woman in their neighborhood had given up her life savings to save a homeless girl's life. The post got shared and shared again, and eventually it was picked up by a local news station. The news segment aired on a Friday evening. They had interviewed Sonia, who'd explained that she'd used her entire savings, $13,800 she'd been saving for 3 years, for modeling school to pay for the surgery of a homeless girl. They'd shown footage of the shop, of Emma helping Sonia organize shelves with her face obscured, and her name changed to protect her privacy. The segment was heartwarming, exactly the kind of feel-good story that news stations love. But one person who saw that segment didn't see it as just heartwarming. Marcus Webb, a private investigator who'd been searching for Emma Harrison for nearly 4 years, was eating dinner when the segment came on. He'd been hired by Michael Harrison shortly after the accident because something about the official story hadn't sat right with Michael. The death certificate had discrepancies. The hospital records didn't quite match up. Someone had orchestrated a cover-up, and Michael had spent nearly 4 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to figure out what had happened to his little girl. Marcus had followed countless dead ends, but when he saw that news segment, something made him pause and look more carefully at the brief footage of the little girl in the shop. The face was partially obscured, but there was something about her. He grabbed his laptop and pulled up the photo of Emma Harrison that Michael had given him nearly 4 years ago. 5-year-old Emma, smiling, holding a stuffed rabbit. He compared it to the girl in the news footage. The more he looked, the more certain he became. That was Emma Harrison. Marcus immediately called Michael Harrison. "Mr. Harrison," he said, "I need you to turn on Channel 7 News, right now. They're running a story about a homeless girl in Detroit. I think it might be Emma." Michael grabbed his remote and found the channel just as the segment was ending. He'd only caught a glimpse of the little girl, but it was enough. "That's her," he'd said, his voice breaking. "Marcus, that's my daughter. That's Emma." Within hours, Marcus had tracked down the neighborhood. Within 24 hours, he'd confirmed through discreet inquiries that a woman named Sonia Carter ran Carter's Corner Shop on Gratiot Avenue and had recently taken in a young girl. Within 36 hours, he'd obtained enough information to be certain. The girl's age matched. Her physical description matched. Even the stuffed rabbit mentioned in one interview matched. Michael had wanted to rush to that shop immediately. But Marcus had counseled patience. They needed to be sure. They needed to verify. So, they'd watched the shop discreetly for 3 days, using long-range cameras, gathering evidence. And with every photograph, every piece of video footage, Michael became more certain. That was his daughter. That was Emma Grace. She was alive. On the 4th day, Michael couldn't wait any longer. That's when he'd gotten into his Mercedes with 3 of his security team in the other vehicles and driven to Gratiot Avenue. That's when he'd pulled up in front of Carter's Corner Shop. That's when he'd seen through the window a little girl who looked so much like his late wife, it made his chest ache. That's when he'd whispered his daughter's name for the first time in nearly 4 years with hope instead of grief. Now, standing on that sidewalk, Michael moved toward the shop door. His head of security, James Jones, moved to go in first standard protocol, but Michael waved him back. This moment was his. He opened the door and a small bell chimed. Inside, the shop smelled like cleaning products and packaged goods and fruit from a small produce section. The woman behind the counter looked up, and Michael saw her take in his appearance, the expensive suit, the security detail visible through the window, the emotional intensity radiating from him. She moved slightly, positioning herself between Michael and the little girl in a protective gesture. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone polite but wary. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Nearly 4 years of imagining this moment, and now that it was here, he couldn't find his voice. The little girl looked up from her coin counting, curious about the stranger. And when her eyes met his, Michael saw recognition flicker across her face, confusion first, then disbelief. Then a dawning understanding that made her small face go pale. "Daddy?" Emma whispered. And everything Sonia thought she understood about this little girl's story was about to be turned completely upside down, because the man standing in her shop, looking at Emma like she'd risen from the dead, was one of the wealthiest men in Michigan, and the conspiracy that had separated him from his daughter was about to be exposed in ways that would make national news and bring powerful people to justice. But that revelation and everything that would follow the reunion, the truth about what really happened 4 years ago, the arrests, the trials, and the miracle of restoration that would come from Sonia's sacrifice, that story continues in part 2.